Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one we start out in the direction of Robotine, where the Russians have managed to secure the fortified positions on the northeastern parts of Robotine, and the first line connected from the east to the west, northwest of Verbove and northeast of Robotine. With this, the Russians have now secured the Robotine section of the front line and returned the front line to what it was almost completely. There is this section right here that needs to be returned, and other than that, the entirety of the Robotine section of the front line has returned to what it was prior to the Ukrainian summer offensive. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Prechystivka, the Russians have managed to gain full control over the town. This is a significant development as it happened with just 2 days of fighting. The Russians gained control of it, and with this, fighting will now continue in the direction of Novoikrenka as well as Solotaniva. This is to completely secure the highway from Pavlivka to Velika Novosilka and to develop offensive operations in the direction of Vuhledar. We see heavy fighting takes place in the western flank. In the eastern flank, the Russians have advanced closer towards Vuhledar, capturing another first line, with which the Russians now are less than 2 kilometers between their frontline positions and the Dacha area of Vuhledar, where we can expect that the Russians will launch an offensive towards Vuhledar soon. The Russians have positions within Mikhailsky, which allows them to bypass the river line in between Pavlivka and Vuhledar. They also have the positions further north with the first line captured, and in the very north in the coal mine direction, fighting is taking place within it. If the Russians gain full control of it, they will have a wide front to be attacking from the east. At the same time, if the Russians manage to cross over the Prechystivka direction, they'll be able to develop offensive operations along the river line and push the Ukrainians back to Vuhledar, which will allow the Russians to cross over the river in multiple sections across the western flank of Vuhledar and potentially directly south of Vuhledar to then push into the western flank as well, which will expand the front line further. At the same time, we see that the Russians have started an offensive towards Vuhledar, where they've managed to capture the southern flank and cut off the road further north of the coal mine, and at the same time, this will allow the Russians to gain a foothold in the southern Dacha areas of Vuhledar. The Russians are also pushing along the main road between the fortified positions and Vuhledar, and in the northern flank towards the northern flank of Vuhledar. So we see heavy fighting in the wide area of Vuhledar, where the Russians will look to gain full control over Vuhledar and the coal mine to the west of it, which will lead to the Russians having full control over the supply routes here north of Vuhledar. And this will expand the front line further to a potential full encirclement of Vuhledar, where only a small area remains under Ukrainian control, of which there is no paved road where the Ukrainians can use to resupply. There is this road right here, but if the Russians gain control over the fortified positions and coal mine here to the east, they can push down south towards the northern flank of Vuhledar and gain fire control of it. Or they could push in a western direction directly towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians from the east, hitting them in the shallow part, which could be an advantage for the Russians, pushing towards fortified positions rather than hitting them face on, and gaining control of that would lead to the final road being cut off. The road itself is connected here from the south, where the Ukrainians would have to go very close to Avdiivka, or they could cross over from the fields just west of Vuhledar. But again, this is something that in the fall season would not be optimal as a supply route, as the weather may turn muddy, which will make it difficult for anyone to cross over the same areas repeatedly. In the next section of the front line, which is the south of Pokrovsk, let's call it the Kurhovo section of the front line, the Russians have expanded their operations in 3 directions. They've managed to enter the village east of Ukrainsk. They have managed to pressure onwards south of Karlivka, and to the west they have managed to gain control over Nevelsky and the entirety of the 2014 line of defense. Now 100% of the 2014 line of defense is now under Russian control. This is following the entirety of the war, fighting over it, And this now means that the Russians are in a position where offensive operations on a larger scale becomes more easy, in the sense that the Ukrainians do not have any foothold near their frontline positions, which they can make use of to launch an offensive through. Instead, the Russians have turned that into a buffer zone where if the Ukrainians launch an offensive, they would have to go through a buffer zone before meeting the Russian defensive lines. This means that Russia needs fewer soldiers on defense and can commit further soldiers to offense. And this is what makes offensive operations easier and more manageable for the Russians with the full control over the 2014 line of defense. We see that the Russians with this advance, which was caused by a Ukrainian withdrawal from it due to the risk of encirclement in the west, the Ukrainians have slowly in stages going to be withdrawing from this pocket here in between the villages all the way to Krasnoivka, where the Russians will be able to develop offensive operations from Krasnoivka towards either of these two directions. The way this is calculated is the fact that if the Russians were expecting to either encircle or completely cut off the Ukrainian soldiers, forcing a withdrawal, then the Russians in this case would be able to use Krasnoivka as a concentration of forces and supplies to launch further offensive operations, either to cut off this retreating force or to launch a new push. If the Russians plan it ahead of time, they can concentrate a large amount of forces and use that at the correct time to gain the most effect. It could be during a withdrawal to rout the withdrawing force, or to take advantage of the empty direction and hit the Ukrainians where they hurt. With a withdrawal of the Ukrainians in the section of the front line, the Russians will likely gain full control over the eastern bank of the Vuhledar river line. This will secure the western flank of Krasnoivka and really secure Donetsk city completely from artillery fire of the Ukrainians, as no more artillery can be used from this pocket towards Donetsk, where the closest positions would be by Kursk or the south of Vuhledar, which is too far to hit the main parts of the Donetsk city. Other than that, the Ukrainians do have longer range equipment which they can still use to strike the city. Other than that, we see that the Russians with this will gain a significant advance, gain control over this entire area, will give a significant advantage to the Russians fighting in this section of the front line, as will allow them to securely focus their forces in the direction of Hirnik, to attempt to cut off the withdrawal or gain full advantage by pushing on in Selidove to gain control of it, and then advance along the railways down south to the north of Kursk. So we see that there are a lot of potentials for the Russians to take advantage of this to develop the offensive operations further. It seems that their main push is here to the south of Pokrovsk. However, with the Ukrainian withdrawal, they are slowing down as the pressure of the Ukrainians will significantly increase to limit the Russian advances to secure the withdrawal of their soldiers in the east. This indicates that the withdrawal is planned and is done to prevent a collapse of this section of the front line. In the Toretsk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced in the Druzhba, as we see with this geolocated footage here. We see that the Russians have been pushing in the northern flank of Toretsk for a while. However, not the entirety of Druzhba remains under Russian control, as there's still this section here in the east, which the Russians with this advance have cut off from supplies, besides this one going on the western bank of the Bakhmutovka river. So we see that there are still Ukrainian presence within Druzhba, but the majority of the town has landed under Russian control. We see that the Russians have been doing positional fighting here in the southern flank of Bakhmut and northern flank of Toretsk to improve their positions. In the Chasiv Yar direction, the Russians have advanced a slight bit to expand their control over the eastern parts of Chasiv Yar and to attempt to gain another foothold across in the crossing across the canal here in the northern parts. This is to expand the supply routes that the Russians have in this section of the front line to allow them to concentrate more forces on the western bank of the canal and also to strengthen defensive operations in this area. In the next section of the front line, located in the Kursk region, we see that the Ukrainians are pushing here northeast of Sutsha, both in the direction of the eastern bank of Ruskaya Konopelka, where the Russians have been able to hold back Ukrainian advances for over a week now. The Ukrainians have struggled to gain control over the village due to the Russians holding positions within it and counterattacking to prevent further Ukrainian advances, but the Ukrainians have now crossed over the river line again, where they are attempting to gain full control over the village and develop offensive operations further. The Russians are using this village as a defensive position due to the large fields that are open after the village, and this means that the Russians would have difficult time resupplying it, but at the same time it also means that if the Ukrainians capture it, it could lead to larger advances or even flanking of the Russian positions further north, which the Ukrainians could be doing right now with this push northeast of Martinovka. And if they capture Ruskaya Konopelka, they would be able to flank from the south as well to pincer the village just north of it. The Ukrainians previously attempted a push north of Martinovka, which failed, and now the Russians have recaptured the position, leading to the Ukrainians struggling to push north of Martinovka, and this is why the focus is now in the east, where the Russians have a weaker defensive position. So see, throughout the front lines, significant developments take place, where the largest advances are taking place by the Russians in the Donetsk region, and generally across the front, besides the Donetsk region, there are some positional fighting. And finally, in the Kursk direction, there is continuous attempts by the Ukrainians to develop offensive operations. However, the Russians are trying all they can to stop the Ukrainian offensive and prevent further advances. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.